Hi, this is our pre-reading lecture for our article by Serna, and we'll be talking about film, politics, and representation. So I wanted to talk briefly about the emergence of film as a new media technology, and think about its role in culture and society. And we'll look at some different approaches that emerge in early filmmaking, and I'm going to offer some links to some clips that you can screen independently to get a sense of what early cinema looked like. And then Serna's article deals with the Mexican Revolution, so I'm going to give you a bit of background about the Mexican Revolution so we know what the story is and how filmmakers are approaching telling this story, which is what Serna gets into in her article. Okay, so what we're doing both this week and in a couple weeks down the road in the semester is that we're going to start talking about the relationship of media, technology, and society. So we'll be looking at film this week. We'll be looking at radio next week, and then in a couple more weeks we'll be looking at American television as well. So media technology is one of the most impactful pieces of technology that almost every single person in the U.S. Works with and uses and engages with each day. Okay, so all media was new at some point, right? And so we'll be thinking about the time when film was new. Okay, so when we're thinking about the late 19th century, which is when film emerges as a new media, we're talking about a period of massive technological, economic, and cultural change. So this is just a little bit of background on what's going on in terms of communication technology, transportation technology, and the accessibility of information and images more broadly. So when we're thinking about the turn of the 20th century, one of the big pieces of new technology that's really impactful is telegraphy. So sending a telegraph was the first instant at which we could know what's going on the other side of the globe more quickly than a letter that has to get on a boat and go all the way around the world, right? So telegraphy makes distant events more accessible more quickly. Then we also see the expansion of print media. So newspapers are becoming more and more accessible. Books are becoming cheaper thanks to new printing technologies such as lithography, and photography is also making images more accessible to more and more people than previously before. So if you think about, folks who would want to get their portrait made, you'd have to hire a painter. So mostly it was the elite getting their portraits made, and now we see photography making representation accessible to more and more people. Okay, so we also see new forms of transport, changing the sense of what we understand to be near and far. So railroads and steamships make places that seemed pretty inaccessible much more accessible. And as we'll talk about a little bit later on, this impacts the flow of people choosing to migrate and choosing to immigrate as well. As transportation becomes more accessible, far off places become places you could actually go. Okay, and this changes things socially, it changes things economically, it changes things culturally. People are moving around and learning much more about the broader world around them. Okay, so we're thinking about this idea of creating an audience. So we're thinking about the relationship between audiences and media. So becoming part of a public, right, becoming part of an audience is something that is taking place in this era in which we see this boom in information, right? Oftentimes we think about the 20th or 21st century as the information age, but we want to sort of reflect on how at the turn of the 20th century, folks were experiencing their own information boom. So one of the ways that historians talk about this era is that information, images, art, and entertainment are becoming more democratized. So if something is becoming more democratized, that means that more people than ever have access to it. So previously, as we mentioned a moment ago, art was mostly for the elite. And now we're seeing that, right, images, photography, and things of that nature are being made accessible to a wider definition of the public. So this idea that the audience is growing in size, our conception of the public is growing in size as well. So this is redefining who's included in the public, and it's redefining who has power as an audience as well. So what we see happening during this era, and this is the era at which we begin to see global capitalism taking hold as the kind of major connective force for a lot of the world, So we begin to see these class identities, the working class or proletariat and the middle class, the bourgeoisie, are beginning to have cultural power. Instead of just elites, right, monarchs, kings and queens, or whatever the case may be, we begin to see these other groups of people who have capital, have money, have buying power, beginning to exert their cultural power. So when we're thinking about how we define a public, we're talking about a group of people that are sharing experiences, sharing tastes, sharing opinions and interests. So if we're members of a public, we are consuming the same newspapers, right? If we are among the early audiences for film. We're becoming part of a viewing public. We're becoming part of a new social alignment that's based around media. So media as a way that develops a set of relationships. Okay. So what's really interesting for us to think about is that among the first people who saw film were working class folks. So film was invented in the late 19th century in the context of a ton of political upheaval and as a major kind of backdrop to the labor and socialist movements that are taking place, at the end of the 19th century. So a lot of people argue that film is politically progressive. It's a popular and democratic art. Its first audiences were the working class. So thinking about how film was oriented to the urban working class makes it a distinctly modern media, and it makes it a distinctly working class media as well. So cultural studies scholar Raymond Williams argues that when we see mass media such as film, newspapers, and so on growing at the end of the 19th century, he wants us to think about how these media can be seen as a liberating force. And so he says, quote, pushing beyond the closed and controlled worlds of state power and the aristocracy. So again, film and newspapers and this growing mass media at the turn of the 20th century is giving more information, more access to a wider set of individuals who had previously had no access to information, no access to political power. So the other thing we want to think about with film is that film develops a third space. So when we think about this concept of the third space, we're thinking about, right, work is one place and home is another place. And then film is this third place, right, going to the movie theater. And of course, things are quite different now. Under our state of a global pandemic, these spaces have become very amorphous. Sometimes we're doing everything all in one space, or we no longer have third spaces such as movie theaters to retreat to. And so we're stuck trafficking between work and home, or we are working from home and, there's nowhere else to go. But in the turn of the 19th century, this development of a third space becomes really significant in terms of developing relationships that are formed because we're all consuming the same media. Okay, so just to give you a little overview of some of the pieces of entertainment that folks were looking at in the 19th century before they were looking at film, the Panorama was this really interesting form of virtual travel that was offered to folks. So what you would do basically is that you would jump into letter A, then you'd walk through letter B, go up the stairs at letter C, and then you'd emerge on this 360-degree viewing platform and be transported to Istanbul, for example, which is what we see over here. And so this was an opportunity for people who were working class individuals living in the city for whom global travel was not really possible. They could pay a couple of bucks and be transported momentarily to another place that they've never been before. So this idea of traveling without having to travel was a big allure to many forms of 19th century entertainment. In Paris, people found entertainment visiting the morgue pretty interesting. It sounds pretty morbid, although if you think about the prevalence of Law and Order, SVU, and other series like that, we can perhaps understand why folks were interested in visiting the morgue. They'd read about something in the newspaper and they'd want to go see for themselves, essentially. Okay. Wax museums developed in the late 19th century as a way for people to gain access to a kind of first-hand view of historic events or current events as well. So the things that we're looking at here is a kind of commemorative wax scene of building the Eiffel Tower. So taking you to the kind of front row seat of history is part of the Wax Museum. So we can see how it relates to the growth in mass media, that it is addressing these things that folks are interested in, whether it's crime from the newspaper's front page, the construction of major 19th century monuments, or this one here is a scene from the French Revolution, so something from history. Okay. Then Daguerre is sort of the immediate predecessor to this idea of moving pictures with his diorama, which is essentially these moving paintings that were backlit. So you see a little guy back there moving them. So what we're really seeing here is that people are getting used to the idea of sitting in a theater together and consuming something, right? Which are the conditions under which people are watching film. Okay, Magic Lantern, likewise, was essentially a proto-film form of projection as well. People would use it to make ghosts appear and disappear. Other folks would use it as a kind of means through which one could give an academic lecture. So this guy's talking about architecture and using this new technology of transparent photographic images that can be projected. Okay, so all of these different forms of entertainment that we just looked at are all about collective viewing, watching things together. And so as we think about film, in our pre-pandemic days anyway, it's about collective viewing. And so film imagines a mass audience. And so the 19th century is drawn to these media spectacles, and what we'll see is that they're also drawn to film for these same reasons, to travel without having to travel, and then to engage in this idea of collective voyeurism. So voyeurism, as we're going to define it, is going to be the ability to look without being looked at, right? So this idea of voyeurism or visual pleasure associated with film comes from the fact that you can, right, watch a film and the people looking back aren't bothered by you staring at them, right? So that is what we're kind of thinking about, excuse me, in terms of this concept of voyeurism. Okay, so right, the film is both a kind of social and technological medium that comes out of photography, obviously, and then kind of takes these cues from already existing forms of 19th century entertainment in terms of how it's going to be exhibitioned. And so we're going to look at two kind of pathways for the invention of film that take place in the United States and in France. So Thomas Edison in the United States kind of thought film wasn't here to stay. He was like, I don't know, I don't think it's going to last, this is kind of weird. And so he imagined it as something that would be solo viewing. So this guy's looking into how somebody would have engaged with Edison's filmmaking practice. So it's kind of like a giant iPod to a certain extent, or iPhone, right? You're watching by yourselves. He's got headphones on. And Edison's films were not engaged in documentation or storytelling. They were duplicating pre-existing forms of entertainment. So they'd film right, vaudeville acts or sideshow kind of scenes and things of that nature. And so significantly, though, he's kind of seeing this idea of, right, solo viewership as opposed to collective viewership, which, you know, maybe he was ahead of the curve in terms of how people are consuming media in the 21st century, but he was definitely off base in terms of what people were looking for in the early 20th century and early 19th century, this desire for collective viewing. Okay, so the Lumire Brothers in France, they are the folks that are kind of like, we know people like to sit in a theater, and we know folks like to watch things together, so that's how we're going to screen our films. And so what the Lumire Brothers were doing, they weren't sort of thinking about documenting other forms of entertainment, but rather they were capturing everyday, ordinary events. And as their empire grew, they started sending cameras all over the world to capture news and current events from far-off locales as well. So we can think about the Lumire Brothers and their approach to filmmaking as this kind of like early YouTube. It's very varietal. Sometimes it's just a slice of life. Sometimes it's a cute animal. But it's a very diverse group of scenes. And so I've got a link here to one of their hit films, which was The Arrival at a Train Station. So I recommend you guys watch that and think about why did people want to watch this? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get together for our Zoom meeting. This is a still from another one of their hit films, Leaving the Factory. And we'll talk about why these kind of particular slices of life might have been interesting as well. Okay, so they're documenting, right? They're essentially creating documentary films, and people are super excited to see their world illuminated and moving before their very eyes. So they become super successful, super popular. Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about before we get into a discussion of the Mexican Revolution, and I'll create a second lecture for it, so just hold on after I get through this, So Millier sees film as a medium through which people can tell stories. So he follows on the Lumire Brothers' technological inventions of how to create films, but what he is doing is essentially using film to create another world, to tell a story. And as we're probably familiar with, this takes off as the kind of main use for film. So stay tuned for part 2.